So there are seven main life processes, and the first one is transport. And transport is how organisms get what they need to all of their cells. And there are a couple of different ways this can happen. Many organisms will undergo osmosis or diffusion, and examples of organisms that will do that will be things like bacteria, protists, non-vascular plants, and fungi. Um, Other organisms have evolved to have an open or a closed system. An open system is in which bodily fluids flow freely, and that's going to be in organisms like arthropods. So examples of arthropods are insects, spiders, and crabs. The opposite of that is a closed system in which fluids are going to flow through tubes, and a couple different categories. In vascular plants, those tubes are going to be xylem and phloem. In vertebrates, that will be veins and arteries. And in invertebrates, so organisms without a backbone, it's going to occur in vessels. The second life process is excretion, and this is how organisms will remove metabolic waste. Again, organisms will do this through osmosis or diffusion through or across the cell membrane, things like bacteria, protists, non-vascular plants, and fungi. Other organisms have evolved internal structures. So in earthworms, they have adapted or evolved what's called nephridia to excrete metabolic waste. Insects have adapted structures called Malpighian tubules. And then vertebrates, we have kidneys. The third life process is respiration, and this is how organisms going to take in and release gases, so things like carbon dioxide, oxygen, water vapor as well. And so organisms will do this through osmosis or diffusion, so bacteria, protists, non-vascular plants, and fungi. Vascular plants have evolved stomata, which are openings on the bottom of a leaf that allows for gas exchange to occur. Annelids and amphibians, annelids are like worms, they respire through their skin. Fish and juvenile amphibians have evolved to use gills to respire or for gas exchange. And then adult amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds all have developed lungs in order to do gas exchange. So you can see that amphibians have actually used all three different types of structures, skin, gills, and lungs, in order to respire. The fourth life process is nutrition, and this is how organisms are going to get their food. We have autotrophs and heterotrophs. Autotrophs are going to be producers. That means they can make their own food. Typically, this is through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. So some protists are autotrophs, specifically euglenas and algae. Some bacteria that are chemosynthetic, that is when they take in chemicals and they produce necessary nutrients. And then, of course, plants can undergo photosynthesis to make their own food. Heterotrophs, or consumers, cannot make their own food, so they have to consume it from somewhere else. So some protists are heterotrophs, so the amoebas and paramecium are an example of a consumer. Some types of bacteria, fungi fall under this category because they are decomposers, so they break down organic material. And then animals are also consumers. Within animals, there are specialized structures to help break down food. So in birds and earthworms, they have evolved what's called a crop and a gizzard, which are two small structures to help pre-digest food before it gets to the stomach. And then, of course, vertebrates have evolved the mouth, stomach, and intestines, which all have specialized structures and enzymes to aid in breaking down food. The fifth life process is regulation and response, and this is how organisms are going to respond to the environment, specifically a stimulus. Remember, a stimulus is anything that can cause a response. And so, of course, organisms will do this through their interaction with the cell membrane, so osmosis and diffusion like bacteria and protists. Other organisms have actually evolved specific types of behavior, and there are two types, innate and learned behavior. And we'll talk about those in another video. So invertebrates have something that's called ganglia, and ganglia are a mass of nerve cells, and these nerve cells are what allow them to respond to the environment. Vertebrates have a little bit more of a more complex system. They have a fully developed central nervous system, which is composed of a brain and a spinal cord. Vertebrates and invertebrates communicate using those nerve cells, and chemical messages are sent from one nerve cell to another in order to signal a response. If you look here on this diagram, you have a nervous cell here. So up here is what's called your dendrites of the neuron. This is your axon, and then you have the terminal end. So what happens is that a chemical message is sent from this body of the neuron down the axon to the dendrites of another nerve cell. And that chemical signal is sent over hundreds of nerve cells in order to get a response. An example of using nerve cells to respond to the environment in vertebrates is the sodium-potassium pump. It's one of the most important pumps in your body, and that's how organisms actively move sodium-potassium across the membrane. Plants have developed certain responses. It's considered a positive response if they move towards something, and it's negative if it moves away. So you have phototropism, which is a response towards light, hydrotropism, which is a response towards water, geotropism, which is a response towards gravity, and thigmotropism, which is a response towards touch. Reproduction is another life process. You have sexual and asexual reproduction, so this is how organisms make more organisms. Asexual is when you have one parent and the offspring are completely identical. So there are three types. Fission, which is when a cell copies all of its contents and then splits. So a lot of unicellular organisms like bacteria and protists will undergo fission or binary fission. Budding is when the growth of the new organism comes off of the parent and then it slowly detaches. That's going to be a lot of multicellular organisms like yeast and sponges. And then other organisms have adapted spores, which is when a single cell can grow into a multicellular organism. But what's unique is that these spores are adapted for dispersal, and they can survive for a long period of time in unfavorable conditions. So that means they can lay dormant or not really respond to the environment until they have received enough water to grow and until the right conditions come along. And so some plants have adapted spores as well as some fungi. Sexual reproduction is when genetic information is required from two parents, and so the offspring will be a combination of those. You have internal and external fertilization. So internal fertilization is when the egg and sperm meet inside the mother's body. And so that will be in things like annelids, insects, reptiles, birds, mammals, and plants. So a ton of organisms. External fertilization is when the egg and sperm meet outside of the mother's body. So the female will normally lay unfertilized eggs, and then the male will come through those eggs or over the eggs and spray sperm over the unfertilized eggs. And so fish are known to do that. It's called spawning in fish, and then also some amphibians. You also have pollination that occurs in plants. Self-pollination is when the egg and sperm from one plant come together and produce an offspring. And then you also have cross-pollination, which is when an egg and a sperm from different plants come together. That is when you have the most genetic variation because you have two different parents. Although there is still some genetic variation in self-pollination because of meiosis and crossing over. And the last life process that we're going to focus on is growth and development. Growth is when an organism gets bigger, and development is when changes will occur throughout the life. So you have internal and external development. Internal occurs inside the mother's body in the placenta. And the placenta is important to the embryo in that it provides nutrition, aids the embryo in respiration and excretion, so removal of metabolic waste. Only mammals have internal development, and only mammals have a placenta. External development will be when it occurs outside of the mother's body. So the female will lay eggs, fertilized or unfertilized, and then all of the growth and development will occur outside of the mother. So things like fungi, plants, annelids, insects, fish, amphibians, reptiles, pretty much everything else except mammals. And then we also had this idea of metamorphosis. This is when major physical changes will occur after birth. And so the best examples are frogs and butterflies, going from different stages of their life cycle. They metamorphosize, and they don't look anything like they do when they are first born.